Chester, Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office or home.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Brown, and thanks to all of our panelists today. I'm really appreciating this. I'd like to start with Mr. Sprayberry. So in Minnesota, flooding disasters have received the most CDBG DR funds, and with what we know is happening, which is climate change, which is increasing the frequency of these flooding disasters across the Midwest. How can programs like CDBG-DR and permanently reauthorizing them, how would that help communities to be able to prepare better, be more resilient to these ongoing disasters?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. And again, this legislation actually requires communities for their projects to make sure that they are being resilient as they build those projects. And so that's really critically important. I think that, again, HUD would create an Office of Disaster Management and Resiliency so that they can keep pushing out projects. We have the CDBG mitigation. Here in North Carolina, what we do is we loop up our CDBG-DR folks with our FEMA folks, and we have a resiliency office. And so we all work together to make sure that HUD allocations, FEMA money, and state appropriations, that we're as efficient as possible so that we take a look at different projects, and whoever is eligible for which project, then we can fit them in that slot so that nobody gets dropped between the cracks. And so I think that this legislation is going to really push the fact that we need to, when we have projects, and when we just don't put a house back in the floodplain.
Right.
We buy it out and move it out, or we elevate it. And so create more green space. And I think that that's what this will help us do. It'll be standardized, and I think it's going to also minimize risk and fraud.
Yeah, thank you for that. I could totally agree. Dr. Martin, some are arguing that state and local government should pay for this kind of disaster recovery and mitigation efforts that CDBG-DR was designed to do. Now, I've worked at the state level and I've worked at the city level, and I've worked at both of those places when my state was dealing with significant disasters, and I just don't see the capacity there. The last time that Minnesota received these funds was in 2008, when city and state budgets were hit incredibly hard by massive flooding. And of course, at the same time, those budgets were being impacted by, would soon to be impacted by the Great Recession. And a lot of this was happening in rural communities where these smaller towns were really hard hit and not in a position. So can you address this issue? Is it really reasonable or realistic to say that local communities can sort of fill this gap if we weren't doing this?
Senator, thank you for that question, Senator Smith. And I think those questions about local capacity are absolutely critical, particularly when we're talking about rural communities. Our studies, the qualitative components of our studies, have actually looked at local capacity issues, and clearly there are persistent issues with the level of emergency managers in rural counties and townships that just simply cannot either afford and don't have the resources to be able to do this. And by definition, we're talking about CDBG-DR being required where there are unmet needs, continuing ongoing unmet needs. So there are tranches of other assistance programs, including those at the same local level, that are filling that immediate need of relief and response already. And those are exhausted by the time CDBG-DR comes in.
That's exactly right. It's not as if those local communities are just sitting on the sidelines. They've already done so much. Dr. Martin, I just want to quickly ask you one other question. Because I'm thinking about the interplay between the role of this CDBG-DR program and the broader challenges, systemic challenges that we have in our country around a shortage of housing. a shortage of particularly affordable housing, both rental and home ownership. And so, what we know is happening in this country is working families are paying more and more of their housing. You've addressed this, more and more for their housing, or they are living farther and farther away from schools or their jobs where housing is more affordable, and then that puts additional costs on their family budgets. And I want to point out that the President's Build Back Better bill, which we are going to pass, would make a significant difference in addressing this systemic housing shortage. But Dr. Martin, could you just quickly talk a little bit about how permanent reauthorization of this program would connect with the broader systemic problems we have in this country around housing shortage?
Certainly, and I'll be quick knowing the time constraints. That is exactly why CDBG-DR plays a critical role in the disaster recovery. It's because it's the Housing and Community Development Agency. So it's aware of the local housing constraints, the local housing markets. So in these cases where the housing market is already in crisis, natural hazard, or excuse me, in many cases, a non-natural hazard, breaks the back of these communities. So there isn't any availability. In many of these cases, after a hazard event, you'll see price gouging, rent gouging. You'll see and of course there are units that are off the market completely because they've been damaged and they're no longer there. So the ability, particularly to build affordable rental housing as quickly as possible, is probably the most immediate benefit of this proposed legislation. But it also just being able to prepare and plan for and incorporate longer-term community housing plans into a recovery framework is absolutely critical.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Cortez Masto.